Handy philosophers, I hope you're enjoying our Gorgias readings. We're going to be continuing on now, and this is really the part of the reading where we start to get the two um, arguers, Socrates and Callicles, outlining their views of the good life. So this is going to be probably a little bit more applicable to at least the next area of study where we start to look at um, modern applications of the good life. So while we're going through this sort of stuff, really, the argument that we're going to see is about the role of self-indulgence versus self-discipline and self-control. What role do these two things play in a good life? Can we have a good life and be very indulgent? Or do we need a high level of self-control and a high level of self-discipline to be able to lead a good life? As you can imagine, Callicles is going to be arguing that self-indulgence is the true pursuit of the good life. This is really what we're trying to achieve in the good life, and that we can measure the good life by measuring how much pleasure we experience. And Callicles means this in sort of the base definition that we're used to referring to pleasure as. Quite literally anything that you enjoy and anything that makes you feel good is something that we should be pursuing as part of a good life. At times, it becomes clear that Callicles is sort of arguing this under a certain level of duress, or he's arguing it purely because he is being a bit pig-headed and doesn't want to concede to Socrates. But I think it's fair to say that he does hold a very hedonistic view that the good life is a life spent pursuing pleasure. Okay. Socrates is going to be very opposed to this, and he's going to be arguing that it's actually self-discipline which is crucial for leading a good life, as this is what allows us to separate, I guess, pleasures that we are right in desiring, desires that we're right in pursuing, and desires that we should be avoiding. And it's a discipline that stops us from, for example, seeking the pleasure that comes from doing things like taking drugs. And it's discipline that allows us to see that we should be pursuing things, let's say like intellectual pleasures, like doing philosophy. Okay, what makes this the better of the pleasures? Well, um, it is self-discipline that allows us to determine the difference between these things. Okay, and so this is the argument that we're going to be looking at. It should be a little bit of a shorter recording, and what we're going to see is actually a whole bunch of arguments via analogy. So initially, Callicles is going to go first, and he's going to compare the disciplined life to the life of a stone or a corpse. And then Socrates is going to provide a whole bunch of other analogies for the life spent pursuing pleasure and self-indulgence. Just to be clear, when we say the life of arguments via analogy, what we're really saying is when you try and convince someone of something by saying that it is like this, okay? All right, so that's an argument by analogy. So this is another argumentative technique that we're seeing presented in the text here. So we're following on from where we were up to. We won't actually be doing a full section of the text. So when I read the italicized paragraph at the start, there will be stuff that isn't actually covered in this recording. That'll be covered in the next. But yeah, highlighters and pens at the ready. We're going to be picking it up from 491e. Okay, and here we go. So Socrates raises the question whether Callicles' superior people, which remember was determined in the last section of the reading, a superior person or the elite person is someone who has gained a lot of political power and has the courage or bravery to see their political goals through to the end. Okay. So Socrates raises the question whether Callicles' superior people are in control of themselves as well as of their communities. Callicles has rejected conventional morality, which which commends or holds up self-control. He thinks that happiness involves self-indulgence. The superior man is precisely the one who has worked his way into a position where he can satisfy any and all of his desires. Socrates states that the opposite view at some length and with considerable power, but Callicles continues to maintain his hedonistic position. Socrates therefore produces two arguments against the equation of pleasure and good. So we'll basically be reading up to the point where Socrates begins to present these two arguments. We'll get all of the analogies I mentioned before that this will be a section of argument via analogy, but that'll be about it. Okay, um, so here we go. So Socrates, but what are they to themselves, Callicles? What on earth are you getting at? Are they rulers or subjects? What do you mean? I'm talking about each one of them ruling himself, or is there no need for him to rule himself, but only others? What do you mean by ruling himself? Nothing complicated, just what people usually mean by it. That is, being self-disciplined and in control of oneself and mastering the pleasures and desires which arise within oneself. What a naive thing to say. By self-discipline, you mean folly. So this is, quite an extraordinary statement here. Callicles is sort of condemning Socrates for saying something that most people would say is really important, being disciplined and not just being indulgent and driven by desire. And he's saying that that's a naive thing to say. Okay. So let's continue on. So for Socrates, I can't believe you said that. I don't see how anyone could fail to appreciate that I mean no such thing. No, Socrates, that's exactly what you mean, because human happiness is incompatible with enslavement to anyone. That's a nice little line there, incompatible with enslavement to anyone. What nature approves and sanctions, on the other hand, I'm going to speak bluntly to you now, is this. The only authentic way of life is to do nothing to hinder or restrain the expansion of one's desires until they can grow no larger. This is an important point to understand. Okay, so Callicles is arguing that we shouldn't be teaching people to be disciplined and to not be self-indulgent. We should actually be teaching the exact opposite. Okay, we should be teaching people to expand their desires until they can grow no further. At which point one should be capable of putting courage and cleverness at their service and satisfying every passing whim. Now, I don't think most people can do this, and that's why they condemn people who can. They're ashamed and they try to disguise their failings by claiming that self-indulgence is contemptible, which, as I explained earlier, is an attempt to enslave those who are naturally better than them. And why do they praise self-discipline and justice? Because their own timidity makes them incapable of winning satisfaction for their pleasures. So Callicles here is again sort of teeing off at the common view that the public have and that society holds, the view of the conventional law. And he's saying that the only reason that we condemn people who are we condemn people who are indulgent is because we can't live like that. Okay, because we're too weak or we're too timid. And so we shake our fingers at people who are overly indulgent and we praise people who are really disciplined. But what's what Socrates is saying, oh, sorry, no, I was right the first time. What Callicles is saying is if we were being really honest with ourselves, then what we'd see is that it's actually incorrect. The good life is the life where we get to pursue every desire we've ever held. We get to indulge ourselves in absolutely everything we want. The only reason we think that this is bad is because we don't actually have the power to do it. But if we did, we wouldn't see it as bad. We would know that it was actually the good life. Imagine someone born to inherit a kingdom, or someone who lacks this initial advantage but has been equipped by nature with the resources for gaining some position of power, for becoming a dictator, for example, or a political leader, like, I don't know, the President of the United States. Uh, in all honesty, could anything be more shameful? Could anything be worse for these kinds of people than self-discipline and justice? They would exchange the freedom to enjoy the good things of life without interference from anyone for the voluntary acceptance of a master, namely the conventions or the laws, opinions, and structures of the majority. Under this wonderful regime of justice and self-discipline, how could they possibly be happy when even if they did have political power, they wouldn't be able to use it to their friends' advantage and their enemies' disadvantage? No, Socrates, if you want to hear the truth, and you do claim that truth is your goal, it is that if a person has the means to live a life of sensual, self-indulgent freedom, there's no better or happier state of existence. All the rest of it, the pretty words, the unnatural man-made conventions, they're all just pointless trumpery. How perfect! How perfect that the last word of that section is trumpery. Because, I mean, surely you can see it. Callicles here is giving us the outline of the life of Donald Trump. Okay, imagine someone born to inherit a kingdom, as Donald Trump did. He inherited this extraordinarily wealthy kingdom from his father, and then they had sort of the cleverness to pursue a political career and become a political leader, and then they could use that position of power to do whatever they wanted and to pursue the interest of their friends. And stand in the way of anything that their enemy wanted. It's Trump. Somehow, Plato, 2,500 years ago, has managed to write a section that is absolutely applicable to the situation we're in today. Not just by chance, like not just ambiguously, but actually using trumpery. This is amazing. Anyway, continuing on. Socrates. Thank you, Callicles, for this generous and frank elaboration of your position. You see, what you're doing here is giving a clear account of things which other people think, but are reluctant to voice out loud. Please, I beg you, do all you can to sustain the momentum until there's really no chance of our mistaking the right way to live. I have a question for you. We shouldn't restrain our desires, you say, if we're going to fulfill our potential, but should let them grow as large as possible and then do whatever it takes to satisfy them. And this you claim is a good state of existence. Is that right? Yes, that's my position. So allowing our desires to grow as much as possible, and then from there, uh, pursuing the indulgence of them, or basically pursuing these desires and the pleasure that comes from them. Uh, yes, that's my position. So the idea that people who need nothing are happy is wrong. So this is people who would have no desires. Yes, because otherwise there'd be nothing happier than a stone or a corpse. So this is sort of the first analogy that the life of self-discipline is comparable to the life of a stone or a corpse. Um, so Socrates, but the people you are calling happy have a terrifying life as well. The point is, you see, that it wouldn't surprise me if Euripides' words were true. Who's to say whether life might not be death and death life? Perhaps we really are corpses. In fact, I did once also hear a wise man claim that we are dead and that the body is a tomb, and that the part of the mind which contains the desires is in fact characterized by its susceptibility to its insatiability. It was this part of the mind, it seems, which a clever storyteller from Sicily, perhaps, or Italy, called a jar, although he derived the name from the fact that it is plausible and persuasive. He also identified fools with non-initiates and said about the part of the mind where the desires are located that in fools, which is to say, when this part is in an unrestrained and uncapped state, it is a leaky jar. This is his analogy for its insatiability. His position is the opposite of yours, Callicles. He produces evidence to suggest that there is no one in Hades, by which he means all that is unseen, worse off than these non-initiates who go about trying to fill uh, one leaky jar with water. They bring to it in another equally leaky vessel, a sieve. According to my source, the storyteller's sieve uh, is the mind. He uses the image of a sieve to imply that the minds of fools are leaky, in the sense that they're too unreliable and forgetful to prevent things spilling out. This is pretty extraordinary stuff, I suppose, but it does clarify the evidence which I'd like to use to persuade you, if I possibly can, to change your mind, to prefer an orderly life in which one is perfectly content with whatever is to hand, uh, to a self-indulgent life of insatiable desires. Am I getting through to you at all? Instead of your previous view, do you accept that self-discipline makes for greater happiness than self-indulgence? Or will it make no difference at all to what you think, even if I tell you story after story with the same moral? Now you're nearer the mark, Socrates. So Callicles has basically said, no, you're right. No matter how many stories you tell me, I'm just going to listen to you like you're a jabbering idiot and not actually take anything you're saying on board. But just to summarize what Socrates has said in this section is that the story that someone else has presented in the past is that, well, the life of the self-indulgent person, this is sort of comparable to having a mind like a leaky jar. It's so incapable of holding on to the right ideas that it's constantly leaky. Now, just to be clear what we mean by this, Socrates is applying it to the life of self-indulgence. So someone with a leaky mind, we might say, is um, the type of person who they desire one thing one day and then another thing the next and another thing the next and another thing the next. And it doesn't really matter whether they achieve these desires or not, because the next day it's just going to change anyway. Their jar never stays full. Now we'll see this analogy pop up a little bit again later on, but we can see here that Callicles isn't buying it. He doesn't support this idea at all. Um, uh, so, um, so now you're nearer the mark, Socrates. So Socrates. All right, here's another analogy from the same school as the one I've just reported. Would you accept something along the following lines as an image for the different ways our self-controlled person and our self-indulgent person live? Imagine that both of them have a number of jars. The jars belonging to one of them are intact and are filled variously with wine, honey, milk, and so on and so forth. And suppose that each of these liquids is rare and hard to come by, and that it takes a great deal of strenuous work to get them. Now, once our first man has filled up his jar, he stops channeling the liquids into his jars and gives them no further thought. As far as they're concerned, he can rest easy. The other character, however, is just as capable of getting the liquids, albeit with the same degree of difficulty, but his vessels are cracked and flawed, and he's forced to work day and night at keeping them full, or else suffer terribly. If this is what the two lives are like, then would you say that a life of self-indulgence is happier than one of self-restraint? Does this argument of mine make any impression on you or not? Uh, Do you begin to agree that a life of restraint is better than a life of indulgence? No, I'm not convinced, Socrates. Now, this is an important reply that Callicles gives, because the one with the full jars can no longer feel pleasure. And that, as I said a moment ago, is the life of a stone. For a person to be fully satisfied, and so to stop feeling either pleasure or distress, uh, that's the life of a stone. An enjoyable life, on the contrary, consists in keeping as much pouring in as possible. So Callicles, to his credit, is really sticking to his argument here in the face of Socrates trying to argue via analogy. Now, the weakness of arguments via analogy is that if the analogy isn't good, then your argument isn't very convincing. And uh, this is kind of what Callicles is saying to Socrates. Well, no, I don't agree with you. Um, the disciplined mind. Uh, well, sorry, he's not saying he doesn't agree with the analogy. What he's actually saying is, you can present this analogy all you want, but the good life cannot be just having jars filled with valuable liquid because, well, what's the point of that? Why would I want these jars filled with valuable liquid just sitting on my shelf? And it's almost like I'm too afraid to ever actually enjoy what's in there because, oh God, then they're going to run out, and then I'll have to go and fill the jars again. And instead, hell, have a leaky jar, and at the very least, continue to fill that leaky jar. Enjoy the liquid. Um, and so Callicles is sort of sticking to his guns here. And yeah, on the screen here, it's summarized Callicles' reply. Um, that the man with the filled jars can no longer experience pleasure. Okay, so Callicles is being very clear here. We don't get pleasure from sort of this idea of resting easy, which is um, what he initially, what Socrates sort of said, that the person with the complete jars that are filled can now rest easy. Um, no, that's not what pleasure is, according to to Socrates. No, sorry, according to Callicles. Pleasure is doing things. Okay, so just resting easy is not the same as pleasure. So kudos to Callicles for sticking to his guns. Um, uh, so, but if there's a lot of stuff pouring in, there has to be a lot of stuff leaving as well, doesn't there? So the jars must be very leaky to let it all out, mustn't they? And Callicles says yes. Um, now you're talking about living like a gully bird or like a seagull, rather than a stone or a corpse. So this again is an analogy. So this is sort of the indulgent life is basically like a life of constantly looking for food and eating, never being satisfied. Um, uh, Living like a gully bird rather than a stone or a corpse. Tell me though, is being hungry and eating when one's hungry an example of the kind of thing you're thinking of? Callicles says, yes. And being thirsty and drinking when one's thirsty? Yes, and experiencing desire in all its other forms too, and being able to feel pleasure as a result of satisfying it, and so to live happily. Okay, and so, yeah, this is an important point. Socrates is trying to clarify with Callicles. So you're basically talking about have desires, fulfill desires, repeat. So get hungry, eat. And the type of pleasure that Callicles is identifying as the pleasure of the good life is really the pleasure that, I'm sure we can all associate this idea of what it's like to feel really hungry and then have something to eat. And it's like, oh, that was so good. Or to be really thirsty and then have a drink. Okay, so that's what Callicles is saying is the good life. Okay, um, Socrates. Did I read that part? So, yes, and experiencing desires. Yes, I did. So, Socrates, thank you very much. This is an excellent beginning, and I hope you can carry on in the same vein without embarrassment. Actually, I'd better suppress my sense of propriety too, it seems. The main question I want to ask is whether a lifetime spent scratching, itching, and scratching, no end of scratching, is also a life of happiness. It's incredible, Socrates, how your arguments are designed purely for popular appeal. So, Callicles here is basically saying, yep, good job, Socrates. Yeah, sort of arguing that he's using reductio ad absurdum again. You're just making my argument sound stupid so that these uneducated morons listening to us agree with you. But we both know that I'm meaning more to life than just itching and scratching. But I'll go along with it. Yep, sure. It's the life of itching and scratching. Um, Well, Callicles, that may explain my success in shocking Polus and Gorgias and making them feel embarrassed, but there's no way to shock or embarrass you. You're too brave for that. So please just answer my question. Well, I'd say that a life spent scratching is a pleasant life, and a happy life too, then, since it's pleasant. Yes, so at this point, Socrates has gotten Callicles to say that pleasure and happiness are now synonymous as well. Okay, that's the point of what he said here, which is he's not going to like really drill down into at the moment, but is an important point later on. Um, so yes, is that the case? Only if his scratching is restricted to his head, or, I mean, shall I continue this line of questioning? What would you say, Callicles, if you were faced with the whole sequence of related questions? At the head of the relevant list is the life of a male prostitute. Isn't this a terrible, shocking, miserable life? I can't believe you'd go so far as to claim that the endless satisfaction of his needs will make him happy. Doesn't it embarrass you to steer the argument to this distasteful, in this distasteful direction, Socrates? So again, uh, the last of the analogies we're going to see in this section is Socrates saying, well, I guess the life of pleasure is comparable to the life of a prostitute, continually having desires met. Um, Seeing as we should just be pursuing the fulfillment of desires and pursuing pleasures, then that must be the good life. Um, so, Socrates, is it me who steers it there, Callicles? Or is this direction prompted by the reckless assertion that people are happy if they're feeling pleasure, no matter what the source of the pleasure? That is, by the failure to distinguish between good and bad pleasures. Could you tell me once and for all whether, in your opinion, the pleasant and the good are the same, or whether there's even one pleasure which isn't good? Okay, so now this is going to be, this is sort of the start of the next section. We'll finish off this part of the reading very soon, just over the page. But you see here Socrates bringing up the idea that he's going to be really pushing from now on, which is, well, is pleasure and good always the same? Or is there a separation between pleasure and good? So if Callicles is so offended by the idea that pleasure is the pleasant life of a prostitute is a good life, if Callicles doesn't agree with this, well, is there then a distinction between pleasure and good? Is that what he's saying? Um, So even one pleasure which isn't good. Callicles, I can't say they're different and still be consistent, so I'll say they're the same. And then Socrates getting a bit frustrated now. You're breaking your original promise, Callicles. If what you say contradicts what you really think, your value as my partner in searching for the truth will be at an end. You don't always say what you think either, Socrates. Well, if that's true, it only makes me just as wrong as you. But are you really sure, Callicles, that unrestricted pleasure is good? If it is, all those shocking consequences I hinted at a moment ago will obviously follow, and a lot more besides. So you say, Socrates. But you're committed to this view, are you, Callicles? And Callicles says, yes. So he's committed to the view that pleasure is the same as good. So this is a really important conclusion. It's going to form the premise for the next section, that pleasure and good are the same thing. Okay. So I hope you enjoyed this little section and the arguments via analogy. These are quite often asked about, and they're not bad to use in, say, essays or anything like that. Just keep in mind that arguments via analogy are good when they work well, but utterly pointless when they don't. Okay, so tread carefully. All right, see you next time.